I have worked the scullery of the Vareth Inner Keep for 11 years, and in all that time I have been invisible. I don't say that bitterly. A woman who is invisible in a palace kitchen is doing her job. The ranges stay hot. The prep tables stay clean. The bread comes out right. Nobody needs to see you for any of that to be true. I came to the keep when my husband Parl died, a lung sickness, quick and without drama, 3 months from first cough to the end. We had run a food stall in the Reaches Lower Market together for 8 years, Parl and I, good years mostly, and when he was gone the stall felt wrong without him in ways I could not fix. My sister Orvith had a post in the keep's laundry. She found me a place in the scullery under the head cook, a broad Vareth woman named Dasseth who had no interest in ceremony and a great deal of interest in whether you could keep a knife sharp and your station clean. I could do both. We understood each other. 11 years. I'm not complaining. The work is steady. The keep is warm in the cold months and there is always food, which is more than the lower market can say. Dasseth retired 4 years ago and I stepped into her role by seniority and general stubbornness, which is how most promotions in palace kitchens happen. I have 12 people under me now, a mix of Vareth-born and 3 other humans besides myself, and we feed the inner keep staff and the lower household every day without much fuss. The state kitchens are separate, up the main corridor and staffed by people with formal training and polished shoes who handle the banquets and the royal table. We handle the porridge. That is the word for it exactly. Porridge. That is what I was making on the night that changed things, and that is what the whole story comes down to in the end. Let me tell you about the Vareth first, because otherwise nothing that follows will make sense. The Vareth are old. Not old the way a grandmother is old. Old the way a mountain range is old, shaped by pressure and time into something that barely remembers what it was before. Their reach has stood for something like 4,000 years by human reckoning, and their court carries that weight in every gesture. A Vareth of the inner court does not simply enter a room, they arrive. They do not speak to a servant, they permit the servant to receive their words. Every motion, every glance, every placement of a cup on a table is the product of tradition, so deep it has stopped looking like tradition and started looking like physics. It simply is how things are done. Their skin runs from pale silver to deep charcoal gray, depending on the family line. Their eyes hold a faint luminescence, usually violet or cyan, that shifts with their mood in ways they cannot fully control and would be mortified to know you noticed. They are tall and fine-boned, with features that look carved rather than grown, and they move like they are always slightly aware of being observed. The aristocracy especially. They are trained to it from birth, every glance calibrated, every silence meaningful, every act of generosity performed for the architecture of the moment as much as for the recipient. I say this not to speak poorly of them. It is simply how they are built. A people who have survived 4,000 years of court politics develop certain habits of presentation. The habits eventually become the people. You can't always tell where one ends and the other begins, which I think must be difficult to live inside, though I am only guessing. The Inner Keep employs something like 300 staff in its various functions. Of those, perhaps 30 work in the kitchens across the 3 levels, the state kitchen above, the household kitchen on the mid-level where I work, and the stores and prep areas below. I know most of them by name. The state kitchen staff and I maintain a relationship of professional mutual acknowledgement. We understand we serve different functions and occasionally borrow equipment from each other, and do not make a fuss about either. Their head cook, a tall Vareth man named Sarath, makes a cold-smoked fish preparation that is genuinely excellent, and he is aware that my reng grain porridge is better than anything his kitchen produces for the morning household. We have never said any of this aloud. We don't need to. This is the shape of my days mostly, early mornings at the range. The smell of grain and stock and the day's bread proving. The particular quality of a kitchen at the hour before the rest of the household wakes. a warmth and stillness and productive quiet that I have never found anywhere else in my life, and that I count as one of the better consolations available to a person who works hard and lives simply. I did not expect any of it to change. The heir to the Reach, Prince Sorvith, was 23 years old that autumn, and he had been performing himself since before he could walk. I knew him the way scullery workers know the High Court, by reputation and corridor glimpses, not by any direct acquaintance. He was the single child of the sovereign and her late husband, born in the old way during a period of succession anxiety that had made half the court hold its breath for 3 years. There had been too many false hopes before him, miscarriages and early losses that the court had mourned in official silence. And when he arrived healthy and whole, the collective relief had been so vast that it nearly constituted its own weather event. He grew up inside that relief like a plant inside a glass jar, tended, observed, carefully shaped by a dozen competing tutors and advisors and protocol officers, each with their own vision of what a Vareth heir should be. By the time he was old enough to have opinions of his own, there were so many people in the room at all times that it was unclear whether any space remained for opinions. The court loved him the way a museum loves its most valuable piece, carefully, at a slight distance, with a great deal of attention to the light. Every person in his life had a function relative to him, and the sum of all those functions was meant to constitute a life. But the sum is not the same as the thing, and I think even people who have never run a kitchen understand that intuitively even when they can't name it. I knew none of this from personal observation. I learned most of it later. At the time, on the night in question, I knew only that there was a state banquet in progress in the upper hall, that it had been going on for 6 hours, and that my kitchen was quiet and warm and smelled of the porridge I was testing for the morning's household breakfast. It was past the second bell of night. My staff had gone to their quarters. I stayed late most evenings, not from duty precisely, more from habit. After Parl died, I stopped sleeping well in the reliable way of a person whose home is undisturbed by grief, and a kitchen at night is a better companion than a dark ceiling and the specific quality of silence that a room has when the person who used to be in it is not. I had the range turned low, one lamp lit at the hood, and I was stirring a test pot of ring grain porridge and making notes in my prep book about the salt balance when I heard the service door open. The service doors of the inner keep connect the upper corridors to the work passages below. They are used by laundry staff, message runners, junior household officers, and occasionally by people who want to move through the keep without being seen in the main halls. I had heard that door open after hours before. It was usually a young page on an errand, or one of the sovereign's personal staff carrying something that needed to disappear quietly from the official record of the evening. I did not look up immediately. That is the scullery habit. You keep your eyes on your work until there is a reason to do otherwise. The spoon was in my hand, and the porridge was at a point in its development that benefited from attention, and whoever had come through the door had not announced themselves as a reason to stop. When I did look up, it was because whoever had come through the door had stopped just inside it and hadn't moved. He was standing at the edge of the lamplight in clothes that were wrong for the time of night. Not wrong in a shabby way, wrong in the way of something very expensive that had been worn for many hours past the point of comfort. The formal tunic of a Vareth High Court function, layered and clasped and embroidered in the dark thread pattern of the inner house, now sitting slightly off-drew on his shoulders as though he had been tugging at the collar for the better part of 6 hours. His silver skin had that particular pallor that, in Vareth faces, means exhaustion rather than illness. A flatness of tone, the luminescence reduced to almost nothing. His eyes, violet, soft, not performing anything at the moment, were looking at the pot on my range. I recognized him in the same way you recognize a face you've seen in corridor passing a dozen times. The heir, Prince Sorvith. Standing in my scullery at the second bell, still dressed for the banquet, looking at my porridge with the expression of someone who has just remembered what hunger is. I did not bow. I want to be honest about that. It was not principled defiance. I simply had a spoon in my hand and a pot that needed attention, and the reflex didn't fire in time. There is a version of this where I was simply occupied, and the moment passed before the instinct arrived, and that is probably the accurate version. By the time I thought to make some gesture of acknowledgement, we were already in the middle of looking at each other, and it would have looked stranger to bow to someone you were already facing than to simply continue. I said, "Are you lost?" I meant it as a practical question. The service passages of the inner keep are not simple, and it was not inconceivable that someone unfamiliar with the back routes had taken a wrong turning from the upper hall. It was only after the words left my mouth that I understood they might arrive differently at a Prince of the Reach than they had intended to depart. He blinked. His eyes did a small involuntary shift, violet going briefly toward gray, then steadying. Whatever he had been expecting from the first person he encountered in the scullery corridors after a 6-hour state banquet, it was not that question. He said, carefully, in the formal register that Vareth use when they are uncertain of the social calibration required, "I was attending the state function." "I know," I said. "It's past the second bell." "Are you lost?" Something shifted in his face. I could not have named it precisely. Not offense. Something closer to recalibration, or perhaps relief at the recalibration, as though he had been braced for a particular kind of interaction and had just been informed that a different set of rules applied in this room. The formal register, in which a response to "Are you lost?" could be considered for several minutes and then delivered with appropriate architectural care. That register had nowhere to anchor itself in the plainness of my question. "No," he said finally, "in the plain register, just the word." "Hungry then?" I said. He was. I could see it clearly once I was looking for it. The way his attention kept returning to the pot on the range, the slight forward lean of someone in the presence of food who is not yet sure they are permitted to want it. 6 hours of state banquet, 17 courses prepared by the finest chefs in the Reach, and from the hollow look of him he had eaten nothing, or nothing worth the name. That is a thing I have observed about formal Vareth functions over 11 years of feeding the household staff who attend them. The food at a state banquet is not for eating, in any ordinary sense. It is for display. The portions are architectural structures, beautiful and intentional, and sized for impression rather than appetite. The flavors are statements about alliances and traditions, and the particular symbolic weight of various ingredients across 4,000 years of Vareth ceremonial history. A person who simply wants to not be hungry goes home from a state banquet in the same condition they arrived, hungry, having consumed several hours of performance in lieu of a meal. "Sit down," I said. "I'll make you something." There was a pause. Not a hostile pause, more the pause of someone running a quick internal survey of whether this was a possible thing. A Vareth of the court does not sit at a scullery work table. That was plain in the several seconds he spent with the sentence. At the same time, the refusal would have required its own performance, a gracious demurral, a protocol-correct acknowledgement and departure, the full mechanical apparatus of court manners. And he was clearly too far past the end of a long evening to produce the machinery. The machinery had been running for 6 hours. The machinery was done. He sat. He chose the far end of the work table, the heavy ironwood table that runs the center of my scullery, and he took one of the tall stools my staff use between prep tasks. He sat the way someone sits when they have been holding a performed posture for so many hours that the act of sitting without performing anything is itself a kind of event. His shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch, which in a Vareth of the court is the equivalent of a visible exhale. He put his elbows on the table. It was, I would later understand, probably the first time in months he had put his elbows on a table without it being a deliberate choice made in awareness of the room. I turned back to the range. The porridge I was testing was my mother's recipe. If you can call it a recipe, it is barely a method. Coarse ground wren grain, which is a pale hardy grain that grows in the mountain belt east of the reach where I was born, soaked overnight and cooked slow with water, and a knob of the rendered fat they call crith in the northern dialect. Crith is something between lard and butter and tastes of neither exactly. It has a particular depth to it, a savory warmth that doesn't announce itself, that simply grounds the whole thing and makes it taste like weather and work and the kind of morning you get through and feel better for having gotten through. My mother made it every morning of my childhood. It is not elegant food. It is food designed to sustain a person doing hard work in cold conditions. And it does that job without apology and without requiring you to be grateful for it in any particular way. I gave the test pot a final stir, adjusted the salt, and ladled a bowl. Not a small bowl, a working bowl the size my staff ate from. I set it on the table in front of him with a flat wooden spoon and a small pot of the salt crith on the side in case he wanted more of it. He looked at the bowl for a moment in a way I could not entirely read. Not disdain, not confusion exactly. Something more like encountering an object for which no existing category quite applied. The bowl was plain earthenware, the spoon was worn smooth from use, and the porridge was exactly what it looked like. "It's plain," I said. "Wren grain, salt and fat, that's all it is." "I don't know wren grain," he said. "No reason you would. It's a mountain food, we grow it up in the eastern belt." I went back to my station, where I had my prep book open and several jars of stock that wanted labeling and a knife that had been waiting for a proper sharpening for 2 days. It keeps you warm. Eat it before it sets. I did not watch him eat. That is a habit from years of feeding working people. When someone sits down to eat, you leave them to it. You do not stand over them. You do not monitor each bite. You do not inquire after every swallow whether it is meeting their expectations. You have your own work, and they have their meal, and those two things can happen in the same room without constant exchange of information about how both are proceeding. My staff understand this. It is one of the things I looked for when I was building my kitchen, people who can be in a room with another person and leave them undisturbed without it feeling like neglect. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is very good." "It does what it's meant to do," I said. He ate the whole bowl. I heard the spoon on the bottom of it and glanced over without making an event of it. He was sitting with the empty bowl in front of him, and an expression on his face that I had not expected to see there. Not the expression of someone who has been served well and is formulating the appropriate acknowledgement. The expression of someone who has just remembered something they had not thought about in a long time, not grief, not longing exactly, but the specific quality of having been briefly returned to something real. "Can I have more?" he said. I gave him more. He ate that bowl more slowly. I continued with the stock jars. At one point he asked what the salt crith was made of, and I told him, rendered fat from the northern highland stock, salted and set, nothing complicated. At another point he asked how long I had worked in the keep. I said 11 years. He said nothing to that, and I did not elaborate, and the lamp on the range hood put its copper-warm light across the stone floor, and the keep was quiet around us the way a keep is quiet after the second bell when the functions are over, and the staff are in their quarters, and the corridors are empty. He left before the third bell. He stood and straightened, and the court posture came back to him in stages, like something he was assembling for the journey upstairs, and he said, and this is what I noticed and have thought about since, he said it in the plain register, not the formal one. He had arrived in the formal register, and somewhere in the 2 bowls of porridge he had put it down and not picked it up yet. He said, "Thank you for the food." Not "thank you for your service." Not the phrase the court uses, which is polished and correct and means approximately what a receipt means after a completed transaction. The plain sentence, "Thank you for the food." I said you're welcome and turned back to my work, and that was that, and the service door closed behind him, and I spent a few more minutes finishing the labeling and then banked the range and went to my own bed. I told no one. There was nothing secretive in it. It was more that the event felt private in the way things that happen in a kitchen after the second bell often feel private. Two people and a bowl of food and no audience. It didn't belong to the general conversation of the keep any more than any other late-night kitchen moment belongs to it. I am not by nature a gossip. I find that most things that are worth knowing eventually find their own way around without my help. 2 days passed in the ordinary rhythms of my work. Morning porridge for the household, midday staff meal, evening supper, the prep and the cleaning and the ordering, and the small daily arithmetic of feeding people. On the third morning, before my staff arrived, the service door opened at the first bell. I was alone at the range. The porridge was starting. The kitchen was cold enough that you could see your breath at the far end, near the door, and warm near the range. And the gradients between were honest about the work still left to be done, before the room was properly running. He came through the door in morning formal clothes, which in the Vareth inner court are still formal clothes, still embroidered and fitted and correct, but slightly less architectural than banquet wear, slightly more like garments a person could inhabit for several hours without the garments becoming the event. His eyes were flat violet, the color they get when the night has been short or unrestful. He looked at the range. He sat at the far end of the ironwood table without being asked. I made him a bowl of porridge. He ate it. I did my morning prep, the first calculations of the day, how much grain had come in overnight, what the cold room looked like, whether the bread loaves had proved correctly through the night. We talked a little. He asked whether wren grain was difficult to grow at lower elevations, and I said I didn't know in any technical sense. I was a cook and not a farmer, and he seemed to find that a reasonable and complete answer. I asked whether the state function had concluded satisfactorily, and he said it had concluded, in a tone that answered the satisfactorily without requiring further discussion. He left before my staff arrived. He came back the next morning, and the morning after. I want to try to describe what those mornings were like before the household was fully awake, because the description matters and I am not sure I will do it well. A kitchen in that early hour is a specific place. The ranges are warming but not at full heat yet. The light is lamplight, not daylight, amber and local, as opposed to the general illumination that comes with the working day. The sounds are the sounds of a person or two at work, not the sounds of a full kitchen, which are louder and more various and carry more information. At that hour, the kitchen is a room that has not yet been asked to be public. It is still a private place, still belonging to itself and to whoever is in it. He fit into that room easily, which I had not expected. There are people who cannot enter a quiet space without disrupting it. They bring a kind of weather with them, a pressure that changes what a room is doing. He was not like that. He sat and he ate and he was quiet or he spoke, and the kitchen continued to be what it was around him. I credited some of that to exhaustion early on. Later I understood it was also temperament. That underneath the architecture of his public presence, there was a person who was genuinely not interested in disrupting rooms, who was perhaps most comfortable when a room was allowed to keep being what it had been before he arrived. My staff noticed when the mornings began to include him with any regularity. You cannot work in a room with someone and not notice when a member of the royal house starts appearing in it at the first bell, and my staff are not incurious people. But they were good about it, all of them in their own ways. Marin, my junior prep cook, young, with the practical intelligence of someone who grew up in a large family and learned early to assess situations quickly and not make them worse, simply began setting out an extra bowl with the morning stack. No comment, no ceremony. The bowl was there when he arrived, and it was the right size, and it was in the right place. I noticed, and said nothing, and that was its own kind of conversation between us about what kind of kitchen we ran. Tovin and Ril, the older Varath on my staff, had a more complicated adjustment. Varath who have worked in the inner keep for any length of time carry the court protocols in their bones, and those protocols activate in the presence of the high house like a reflex that doesn't ask your permission first. The first week or so, Tovin in particular worked with a careful formality whenever Sorvith was in the kitchen, correct, precise, a little stiff. Sorvith himself never triggered any of this deliberately, which helped. He sat at his end of the table and ate his bowl and was quiet, and did not produce any signal that required the formal response. After a while, Tovin simply worked, and the kitchen had its ordinary sounds, and the stiffness had nowhere to live and quietly left. I began to understand, across those mornings, what it was he was coming for. It was not primarily the porridge, though he genuinely seemed to like it, and asked me once about the difference between the coarse grind and a fine grind, and listened carefully to the answer. It was the quality of the room itself. In my kitchen, at that hour, nobody needed anything from him. Nobody was reading his luminescence for cues and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Nobody was waiting for a pause in his speech to insert the thing they needed him to know. Nobody was performing attention at him, which is a different thing from giving it and exhausting in a specific way that I think is hard to articulate unless you have been on the receiving end of it for 23 years. My staff were there to do their work. I was there to do mine. The ranges needed tending, and the bread needed checking, and the prep list needed working through, and nobody in the room required anything from him to complete their morning. He could put his elbows on the table. I don't know if he was consciously aware of how much that mattered. People often aren't, when they have been longing for something so long it has become indistinguishable from the general background ache of being alive. They just know the food helped. We talked more as the weeks went on. Not deeply at first, the surface things that two people cover when they are establishing what kind of room they are in together and what the rules of it are. He asked about my work with genuine curiosity, not the performed curiosity of someone who has been told that taking an interest in servants is a virtue. He wanted to understand the actual logistics, how you planned a week of household meals around what the supply runs produced and what hadn't arrived and what was about to turn, how you managed 12 people with different skills and different temperaments across a 10-hour day, how you decided what order to do things in when 3 things needed doing at once and only 2 of them could be done simultaneously. These are real questions. I've been asked versions of them by people who ran stalls and by other kitchen heads, and occasionally by young cooks trying to understand the work they were entering. I've never been asked them by a member of the royal house. I answered them the way I answered anyone asking about my work, plainly, with the concrete details, because the concrete details are where the work actually lives. He asked about my background eventually. Not in the first weeks, in the 4th or 5th week, on a morning when the kitchen was quiet and the porridge had come out particularly well, and there was a kind of ease in the room that made the question natural. I told him about the mountain belt, my family, the food stall years with Parl, the way I had ended up in the keep. He listened the way he listened when something interested him, not performing attention, just giving it, with the particular quality of attentiveness that makes the speaker feel that the words are landing in the right place. He talked about his own days in return. Not immediately and not all at once. It came out over many mornings, in pieces, the way things come out when someone has not had a room in which to put them for a long time and is discovering that a room exists. He talked about the difficulty of being always read. The Varath luminescence is, he told me once, more responsive in him than in most of his family line. His eyes shift more readily and more visibly, and he has never fully learned to dampen it under sustained close observation, which means that in any formal gathering there is always someone in his peripheral vision tracking his eye color and constructing an interpretation from it. and those interpretations travel through the court and become facts that other people act on. So that he is perpetually part of a consequence chain he never intended to start. He said this as an observation, not a complaint. The distinction matters. He was not asking for sympathy. He was describing the shape of his days to someone who had asked. I told him about looking at something fixed and neutral when you need to quiet a reflex, that it sometimes helps to redirect where the input is coming from, give the nervous system something boring to attend to while the response settles. He said he'd never tried it. I told him the stove top was neutral, plain gray iron, nothing worth a response. He looked at the stove top for a moment. Something in his face settled. "You're very practical," he said. "I'm a cook," I said. He talked about his mother, the sovereign, with a care that was visible in how he chose his words. The care you use around something that matters to you and is also in some way fragile. She was well. She was ruling as she had always ruled, which was with great competence and a long view and the kind of absolute commitment to the reach that becomes, over 40 years, indistinguishable from the thing itself. He watched her with the specific sight of someone who has known a person long enough to see them and loves them well enough to be sad about what they see. The way a function, pursued long enough, starts to eat the person who performs it, not because the function is wrong. Because functions are very good at what they do, and people are slightly more complicated than functions, and the fit is never quite perfect, and over time the imperfect places get worn smooth. He said this without self-pity, which I noticed and respected. Self-pity requires an audience that will respond to it in a particular way, and I think he had stopped expecting that kind of response from anyone, so the observation came out clean, without the emotional shape that a bid for sympathy would have given it. Just the thing as it was. I said that watching a person become a function was hard, in my experience. He asked if I had watched that with someone. I told him about Parl's final months, not all of it, just enough to be honest. The illness had its own logic, its own demands, and for the last several months Parl had been managing the illness rather than living his life, and the difference was visible in small ways even when he was working hard not to let it be. There had been mornings near the end when I made porridge and sat with him while he ate it, and those were the most like himself he was all day. Because it was just the two of us and a bowl of food, and neither of us needed anything from the other for the length of that bowl. Not care, not attention, not courage or endurance or any of the harder things the illness required. Just company and food and the morning. Sorvith was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "I'm sorry about your husband." "It was 8 years ago," I said. "That doesn't make it not worth being sorry about." I went back to my prep work. The morning had the particular quality of certain mornings in late autumn when the keep stone has cooled overnight, and the range heat is still working its way into the air. So the room holds warmth and cold in layers at the same time, hot near the fire, cool at the walls, honest about where it stood. I've always liked that quality. It is not comfortable exactly, but it is true. "You come here because nobody wants anything from you," I said. It was not quite a question. He looked at the stove top for a moment. "I come here because you make good porridge," he said. "That too," I agreed. The court noticed, of course. They were always going to. A prince of the reach taking breakfast in the household scullery every morning for weeks running is not an event that goes unobserved in a palace whose professional purpose is observation. What I gathered, because information does not come directly to my kitchen, it arrives filtered and processed through Orvith in the laundry, through Marin's sharp peripheral awareness, through the osmosis of household conversation, was that the court's reaction moved through several distinct stages. The first stage was confusion. The court had no existing category for the heir spending an hour in the scullery. It was not a romantic attachment. There were protocol structures for those, however convoluted, and this did not fit any of them. It was not a charitable impulse or a ceremonial duty or a political signal. It was not a mentorship. It was a prince eating porridge at a work table before the working day began, regularly, for no apparent reason the available frameworks could capture. The court cycled through its frameworks and found none applicable and was troubled by the gap. The second stage was interpretation. Having no category, the court constructed one. The interpretations I heard secondhand ranged from an unconfirmed theory that Sorvith was developing a policy interest in household food supply chains. Unusual, but not without historical precedent among Vareth heirs with reformist inclinations. To a more elaborate reading involving a human Vareth folk tradition about the restorative properties of northern grain preparations in times of constitutional stress. A tradition that I was confident did not exist, and that had almost certainly been invented by whoever proposed it to make the situation fit a known shape. Humans in the Reach have accumulated a modest mythology over 4 generations since the first treaty, and the court is inclined to reach for any part of it when something needs explaining, and the plain explanation seems insufficient. The third stage was anxious deference. If the heir chose to take breakfast in the scullery, then the scullery must be significant, and things that were significant required official attention and management and accounting. In this stage, I received a visit from one of the sovereign's household managers, a precise, brisk Vareth woman named Ossel, who came during the midday quiet with the manner of someone who has been given a task and intends to complete it correctly. She told me with great professionalism that the inner court had noted my kitchen's contributions to the heir's morning schedule, and wished to formally acknowledge the kitchen's service, and was there anything I required. I thought about it seriously. I said I could use a new set of range brushes, as the current ones were worn to the point of being less effective than they should be, and that the morning delivery of Wren grain had been arriving a half-bell later than ideal, which compressed the overnight soak. Ossel wrote both down without visible reaction. The range brushes arrived the next morning. The grain delivery time shifted. I did not tell Sorvith about this conversation, because I knew what expression it would produce. The corner-of-mouth movement that in a Vareth of more expressive temperament would have been a full smile, combined with the slight violet-to-gray shift of the luminescence that meant he found something genuinely funny, and was mildly resigned about it at the same time. And while I did not find that expression unpleasant, I saw no reason to cause it before breakfast. He found out anyway. He noticed the new range brushes the next morning. He noticed things. It was a quality of attention that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with who he was and asked. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth did the thing I had expected. "Range brushes," he said. "And the grain arrives earlier now. The court has decided your kitchen is strategically significant." The court was probably going to decide that regardless of what I asked for, at least I have good brushes. He ate his porridge. The fourth stage, when it came, reached me directly, in a way the others had not. Through a note, written in the sovereign's own hand, delivered by a personal page on a morning when Sorvith had already gone and my staff were deep in their midday prep. The page placed it on the edge of the work table and left without waiting for a response, which told me something about the instructions he'd been given. It was short. The sovereign did not use more words than a thing required. It said, "I am told my son takes his morning meal in your kitchen. I am told he has been doing so for 6 weeks. I am told he sleeps better now. I wanted to say thank you directly from one person to another." She had signed it with her personal mark, not the sovereign's seal. I read it twice. Then I put it in the drawer where I keep things I don't want to lose. The note Parl sent me the week we decided to open the stall, Orvith's first letter from the keep when she just arrived, a few other things of that order. I thought about it for several days. About the sentence, "I am told he sleeps better now," how she had received that information from whom, and what it was like to be the sovereign of the Vareth Reach and know your son's sleep from second-hand report rather than from the ordinary nearness of a parent. about the choice she had made to write thank you in plain words, without the formal apparatus of court gratitude, which would have been easier and safer and would have meant considerably less. The formal apparatus distances the feeling from the speaker. She had declined the distance. I thought that was probably not easy for a person who had been the sovereign for 40 years, and I thought she had known it would not be easy when she picked up the pen, and I thought that said something about her that was not captured in any of the things the court said about her. I did not reply formally. I did not know what a correct formal reply from a scullery cook to the sovereign looked like, and I was not sure a correct formal reply was what the note had been asking for. Instead, the next morning, I made an extra portion of porridge and left it covered on the counter near the service door with a note that said, "The recipe, if you ever want it." I left the full method written out in my clearest handwriting, the overnight soak and the slow heat and the salt and the krith and the mountain dialect name for the grain. I don't know if she made it. I never heard directly. About 3 weeks later, Orvith mentioned that the sovereign had asked the stores to begin stocking Wren grain. I filed that information in the same drawer as the note. The cold months came properly after that, the way cold comes to the reach, a slow settling of temperature over several weeks until one morning you wake, and the stone walls have stored enough cold that the air indoors tastes of it, and the ranges run hotter to compensate, and the kitchen smells more strongly of grain and fire than it does in the mild seasons, which I have always found a better smell. Cold weather cooking has a different quality to it. The dishes need more time, more heat, more of the particular patience that goes into a thing that won't be hurried, the long braises, the slow porridges, the breads that need extra warmth to prove. I like that quality. There is a satisfaction in it that mild weather cooking doesn't quite match, the satisfaction of making something that the cold is specifically working against and winning. Sorvith kept coming through the cold months. The mornings were darker when he arrived, and he came slightly later as the season deepened and the court's schedule presumably shifted with the short days, but he came. My kitchen was warm and the porridge was on the range and Marin's extra bowl was on the stack and the ironwood table was waiting. There was a morning in the deep cold when he came in carrying weight. You learn this about people when you work with them long enough, the quality of presence that tells you what they're walking in with before they say a word. He sat and was quiet through most of the first bowl, and I said nothing, and the range hissed and the bread proved, and the morning did its ordinary work around us. Eventually he said, "There is a question of my marriage." "There usually is," I said. "The court has 2 candidates." He was using the formal register, which I noted. It had been weeks since I'd heard it from him in the kitchen. Its return meant he was handling something difficult with the tools available to him, which was understandable. Both are appropriate. Both have strong cases. Both are excellent in every measurable regard. The court has been unable to decide for several months and has begun asking me to decide for them. And I find that I cannot explain, in terms they can use, why I am having difficulty wanting either arrangement when I'm not certain I understand what wanting an arrangement would feel like. Given that I have never made a decision of this kind without being handed the category, it was meant to fit into first. He put down his spoon. He never put down his spoon before the bowl was empty. "You're not asking me to help you decide," I said. "No," he said, "I know you couldn't. That's not what I'm trying to do." "What are you trying to do?" He thought about it. His eyes went to the stove top. "I think I'm trying to say something about what it feels like. To be in a situation where every relevant factor has been analyzed correctly by very competent people, and the analysis is accurate and still the thing being analyzed feels as though it belongs to a part of the situation that the analysis cannot reach. And I don't have anyone to say that to." I let that sit for a moment. "When Parl and I decided to run the stall together," I said, "there was no category for it either. He was from the river lowlands and I was from the mountain belt, and our families had lists of more sensible arrangements available to each of us. The lists were accurate. The reasons on the lists were real reasons. What made you do it? He made very good braised fish. And when I was with him, I didn't have to explain why I found most things more interesting than I was supposed to find them. Those aren't the same thing as the categories on the lists, but they were realer than the lists. Sorvith turned this over for a while. He picked up his spoon and finished the bowl. That's not much like my situation, he said. No, I agreed. But the part about the category not reaching it, that's probably the same. He left a little later than usual. Marin gave me a look over the prep table that I received and did not respond to, because the look was accurate and commenting on an accurate look seemed unnecessary. The decision he made when he made it came from him and not from the court's analysis, which I gathered from Orvith was considered somewhat unconventional in the procedural history of Varath succession marriages. I did not learn which of the two candidates he chose, or rather I heard 3 different versions and could not determine which was correct, and it was not my place to investigate. It was his life. I made the porridge. The event that generated the sentence I had not heard yet but would, within the week, happened on a morning in the deep cold when I was not present. Arvin, who was the halb, assigned to the inner corridor near the state function rooms, told me about it in the afternoon while I was finishing the evening prep. He was 11 years old, earnest in the particular way of 11-year-olds who understand they are carrying something important and are taking the responsibility seriously. One of the sovereign's senior court officials, a man named Kerv who administered some portion of the Reach's outer relations, had raised the question formally in a morning function at which Sorvith was present. Not as an attack. Kerv was a careful and genuinely puzzled man and posed it as a matter of protocol. There was no established category for the heir's extended use of the household kitchen, and in the court's view, gaps in the categorical framework required addressing. What precisely was the function of this arrangement? Sorvith had been quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that, in a Varath face, contains a decision. Then he said, and Arvin reported this with the precise verbal accuracy of an 11-year-old who has been rehearsing the relay for 3 hours. She fed me when I was hungry. Every cook in this keep has the training and the skill to produce a fine meal. She is the one who noticed I hadn't eaten. Kerv apparently did not have a follow-up question. Arvin told me this, and then stood very straight and watched my face to see what I would do with it. "Thank you, Arvin," I said. "Are you going to do anything," he asked, "with the information?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. He looked the way 11-year-olds look when the world contains less drama than seemed likely. I told him there was porridge in the pot if he wanted something before he finished his evening route. He did want something. He sat at the far end of the ironwood table, the same stool Sorvith used, though Arvin's feet didn't reach the floor, and ate quickly, and with enthusiasm, the way hungry young people eat when no performance is required, and then went about his business. I cleaned the range and banked the fires and stood for a moment in the quiet of the evening kitchen, the lamplight on the stone floor, the smell of the day still in the warm air around the range. I thought about the sentence, the flatness of it, the way Arvin had reported it, not a declaration, not a tribute delivered with the weight of ceremony, the language of a fact. She fed me when I was hungry. The simple sentence, offered in response to a question about categories. I thought about what it meant that in the full apparatus of the Varath inner court, the trained chefs, the protocol officers, the courtiers who had studied him since before he could speak, the advisors whose entire professional function was the anticipation and management of his needs. The thing that had mattered was a bowl of coarse-grained porridge and a woman who went back to her stock jars without requiring anything from him in return. I don't think it reflects poorly on the court. The court is built for certain things and not for others, and it is very good at the things it is built for. The problem is that the things a court is built for do not include simply noticing that a specific person has not eaten and making them something plain. That is too small for a court. Courts are designed for the important, which means they are often designed past the ordinary human things, the things that happen between two people in a warm room at a late hour, the things that don't require a framework to be real. I think it reflects something about the work of seeing people, not the work of reading them or managing them or positioning yourself well relative to them. The simpler prior work of noticing that a specific person is standing at your door at the second bell and has not eaten. The correct response to that is very small and very old, and almost everyone knows it without being taught. You feed them. That is not sophisticated knowledge. My mother knew it. Parl knew it. Most people who have run a food stall or a kitchen or a household know it in their bones, as habit, as reflex, as the kind of thing you do without thinking of it as anything worth noting. It just sometimes gets lost in the architecture, not because anyone chose to lose it. Architecture tends toward that. The bigger and more elaborate a structure becomes, the more the small plain things fall through the gaps in it. That is not a fault. It is the nature of large structures. The gaps can be patched if someone is paying attention and knows what plain things look like. The cold months passed. The early thaw came. The mornings warmed slowly, the stone walls releasing what they had held all winter, the kitchen reaching its operating temperature faster than it had in months. Sorvith kept coming through the thaw, though less often as the season opened and his schedule apparently expanded. The days he came were still early, still before my staff arrived, still the first bell and the lamp and the plain bowl and the ironwood table. On a morning in the middle of the thaw, he said, "I've been asked to take a larger role in the outer sessions. It will mean more time away from the keep." "That's the work," I said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the range. "I'm glad it's here." He meant the kitchen. I understood that without needing him to clarify, the way you understand things about a room you have shared with someone for long enough. He meant the place that would still be here, the range, the ironwood table, the extra bowl on the stack, the first bell and the amber lamp and the plain, ordinary warmth of it. "It'll be here," I said. He nodded and finished his porridge, and left a little earlier than usual because the schedule was already asking for him. He still comes when he's in the keep. Less often than before, the outer sessions have taken up the pattern his mornings used to have, and I imagine they will continue to do so as the work grows. But when he comes, the service door opens before the first bell, and he sits at the far end of the ironwood table, and I make the porridge, and we do our respective work in the same room. Sometimes we talk about small things. Sometimes we don't talk much at all, and the kitchen has its ordinary sounds and its ordinary smells, and the morning is what it is. Marin still sets out his bowl without comment. She is going to be a very good cook one day when she takes a kitchen of her own. She already understands the thing that matters most, which is that a good kitchen is a place where people can be what they are without being required to be anything else. The range brushes are very good. The grain arrives early. That is the whole of it, more or less, and I have been told it is more significant than I understand, by Orvith, who is kind and probably right, and by Marin, who is practical and probably also right, and once by Tovin, who said nothing at all but gave me a long, slow look from across the prep table that was its own entire conversation. Maybe they are right. Maybe I am missing the significance. I am a cook, not a courtier, and significance was never my particular specialty. I think of it as a kitchen thing. Two people who each needed something, him a room where nobody required anything from him, me the satisfaction of work that landed where it was meant to, and the luck of a warm scullery at the second bell, and a pot of grain on the range. That is what a kitchen is for, at its best. Not the elaborate performance of it, not the statement of it, not the architecture of it. The plain version, a warm room, a bowl of something honest, and another person who is willing to be in the room with you without asking you to be different than you are. My mother's porridge was for that. Parle's braised fish was for that. The stall in the lower market was for that, on the mornings when we opened early and the market was still quiet, and we cooked for the workers before the day began. It is a very old function. It does not require a category or a protocol. It just requires someone paying attention and knowing what plain food can do. I still make the ring grain porridge the same way. Coarse grind, overnight soak, slow heat, salt and krith, nothing added. It does what it's meant to do. That's enough.